Welcome to another edition of the Audit Opinion. I'm delighted to be joined here today by Randy Johnston, somebody who I've known and respected for a number of years at this point in time. So, Randy, for those who don't already know you and instantly recognize you, could you give us an intro?
Well, good day, Mark, and thank you for the invitation to work with you and your listeners. I am Randy Johnston out of Hutchinson, Kansas. Have worked in the technology industry. I hate to say it at this point, for over 60 years, and with CPA firms for over 50 years. Most people know us because of my K2 business, where we produce loosely 1,600 events a year for continuing professional education in the U.S. and PD in Canada, to around 100,000 direct attendees that register with us, many more that attend public events. So have been writing articles for 25 plus years for CPA Practice Advisor, and actually have a podcast that Brian Tankersley and I do together there weekly.
Randy, for listeners, we're going to delve into one of those articles that you referenced there. It was about being audit ready, and I thought it really was an interesting take on how clients of accounting firms can really get themselves into a better position to perform the audit process, a topic that's very dear to my heart. So, would you mind just introducing the topic and laying out the problem that you're looking to solve with this article?
Well, Mark, there were three or four things that I was thinking about when I did this. In fact, if things go right today, I'll actually pick up a compilation for one of my organizations from my CPA firm later this afternoon. But I also serve on the board of directors of multiple organizations, and we have fairly extensive audit work done with those. And it seemed to me that if you can get your own internal team to get their act together and provide the auditors better content, better background, more organized data, you'll get more value from the audit when that happens. So that's why the steps that I laid out, that, what are we trying to accomplish with the audit internally? In other words, what's our purpose? And then from there, making sure that we have our financial records well organized. Uh, in fact, I am going to ask that same question of my CPA later today, saying, your practices may have changed. Is there something that I can do, should do to make it easier for you? And then beyond that, it's really the back and forth. I really consider a well-done audit a collaborative process. That's one of the things, frankly, I've admired in your inflow platform since inception, as you laid that out to me, because this ability to work directly with the client where documents seamlessly flow back and forth and questions can be asked back and forth, that's a real big deal to me too.
So, this is coming from a place of personal experience of you having worked yourself with accounting firms, with organizations that you have with accounting firms. And I think that really comes across in the article. There's a clarity there in terms of that personal experience and that perspective that you bring, Randy. Before we jump into the detail of the conversation, is there like a single sentence or a way you would phrase being audit ready? What does audit readiness or being audit ready mean to you in a snapshot?
Well, this may sound a little simplistic, but it is that your financials are in order, that your balance sheet income statements are at balance, and that you have all of the supporting documentation needed for audit review. Uh, if I got a little more complex on it, it might be that you can back up any transaction with detail when asked. But if we stay on that simpler path, I'm amazed how many organizations just throw financial statements over the wall and they're not really ready. It's like, okay, what's your accounting team doing here? So that isn't a big ask. It's something, frankly, that almost should be done on a monthly basis. And I'm far more close, Mark, to the school of continuous auditing and daily dashboards and financial statements. I like things tight. on a pretty regular basis. And I know we can't be perfect, but we can be pretty doggone close in today's world where transactions are electronic and can flow through. So there's lots of things, and I'm actually very concerned in this year, like most years, but more so this year, about the amount of fraud that is likely to be committed. We're at a time when there's lots of motivation for people to commit fraud, and that there's not much penalty for committing fraud right now.
What is some of your thoughts in terms of best practices for both the client and the accounting firm in using a PBC prepared by client list to drive an efficient and an effective audit process?
Yeah, Mark, one of my favorite things to talk about with auditors and clients alike. So you are correct. Uh, PBC, or prepared by clients, sometimes also called client request list, sometimes also called document request list. So it's got lots of monikers, if you will. But I would suggest for possibly 20 years, I've been pretty adamant about trying to use an electronic version of a PBC list. And there were portals that attempted to do that. In the US market today, my best count is there's 90 plus, 94 portals attempting to do this whole PBC request list. And um, many not doing a very good job, frankly. So that is a challenge. But bottom line is on the PVC list, I would like my audit team to actually have a fairly structured, well thought out, standardized request list, and then extend that with specialized documentation they might need based on the risks that they see by client or specific things that they might be auditing. Now, when you're doing audit, obviously you're trying to look at all of the documentation, but you don't have enough time in most cases to look at all documentation every year. So there may be a focus year to year to year where your team focuses around some particular issue. So, but going back to BBC, if I can get a very standardized list, if they can be electronic, if you can submit the list to the auditor, if the auditor can look at the list fairly shortly after it arrives and say, yeah, that's what I need, or no, that's not what I need, and send it back. Okay. And that the PVC list actually has a follow up feature. I've nicknamed that auto nag, Mark, where the system will just remind the client, hey, you didn't get this in. Send it to us. Those can be a little annoying, but the bottom line is people forget, they think they've got everything, but if you're missing a document, that's good. Now, on the other hand, if I'm the client preparing the documentation, I've got work that I'm doing too, but I'm gathering all this for the auditor, and it's easy to drop a ball or easy to miss, or frankly, just misunderstand the request. But my head is in the thick of it when I'm gathering all this documentation. So if I upload it through the PBC tool, the auditor should be able to peek at it and say, yeah, that's what I needed, or reject it. But if you reject it right away, I've got all my documentation, my thinking right there. I can probably respond more rapidly. If the audit team lets it sit for a while, the client's also going to forget what was going on. So it's really both sides of the formula making the problem a little bit worse. But but the real deal here is, as a client, trying to provide the auditor all the documentation needed the first go. And it is really inefficient for audit teams to pick up an audit that's got only partial documentation and put it back down and resume again. It's just as inefficient for clients to try to gather documentation and set it aside and pick it back up. So this whole PDC request, to me, that's so critical to efficiency for the client and for the firm. It really needs to be done right.
PBC lists is something I think is going to be even more important going forward because of the impact of data, automation, and AI. I wanted to get your take on, as we start to look at moving the PBC list away from a bunch of spreadsheets and reports out of the system, and we start to adopt greater use of data feeds, data sets, APIs. How do you see that impacting that information exchange component of the audit process?
Mhm. So, Mark, I'm going to push this even a little further than you just asked the question, but I want to make sure our listeners understand the implications because I like to get real time information with very little real time work. And many of the systems today can provide external interfaces with those APIs, the application program interfaces. It's a way we can talk to these systems. Now, many systems, I believe, including yours, can read a variety of accounting software data indirectly, but there's a whole bunch of accounting systems out there that you can't do that with. So your best chance is going to the APIs. However, in this world now today, the APIs are being automated even further with MCPs, Model Context Protocols, which are AI interfaces into these systems. And yesterday, uh, the day before we're recording this, yesterday, I was actually working on an MCP on an accounting software product where we had automated it enough we could ask AI based questions to retrieve data. All right. This is a whole different ball game now because if as an auditor or if as a user of a system, you can now use AI to ask questions pretty much in real time, you'll be able to extract information that you've just never been able to afford to ask before. So you are dead spot on. I think the days of these spreadsheets to exchange information are coming to a close, and we should see more and more system to system automation depending how audit platforms and accounting platforms are modified for this real time data exchange. Data is the thing here. I mean, and we could go back to continuous auditing. What is that? That's about data too.
Really interesting perspective of how those different systems, which historically the systems used by a finance team or an organization for their bookkeeping, the QuickBooks, Sage, Zeros of this world, have very little commonality or integration with the systems that accounting firms are using to perform their audit processes. And so there is an opportunity to try and create more connectivity and more flow there to try to automate a lot of that clunkier, more manual extraction, upload, download process from this process, which I believe creates quite a significant inefficiency in the overall performance of the audit process.
And if I flip that over, if you had that efficiency, that's a tremendous value. Certainly is something that to be desired as I would see it.
As we see data analytics, AI, and broader automation across professional services more broadly, across accounting, across audit, um, that places a greater level of focus on the quality of the inputs. So, what is the data that's going into this analytic? What's the training material that this AI is referencing and built on? How do you see that impacting, Randy, some of the areas of the audit process? What do you feel is going to need to change or need to have a greater level of prioritization?
Mhm. Well, Mark, an old classic saying on that, "Garbage in, garbage out." It's far greater than that as I would see it, because if you're really gonna run analytics, you have to be convinced that your source data is accurate. And, I think most auditors are cognizant enough that they are picking the right uh, things to look at to run those analytics. But, a faulty assumption here can produce an erroneous observation. And, I am concerned about that because um, the volume of data being handled, the parameters, that's not quite the vectors of the data, being considered. Those can get really dicey here. And of course, you've got a little bit of conflict of uh, goal between what the client wants, clean opinion, and what the auditor wants, also uh, purely audited data, if you will. Sometimes those get pushed, and I've listened to some of those conversations in situations where the client's asking for unreasonable things. And, the auditor's trying to say, well, here's what it really is. Uh, those can be pretty uncomfortable. So I'm not sure I got to the heart of your analytics question, but all of those things were conflicting as I was thinking about a reasonable response for you there.
Technology is lauded quite broadly as being a transformational savior of the audit process. It's going to improve the efficiency, the quality, the experience in its entirety. If we dig into this a little bit, Randy, what are you seeing and hearing as being the key benefits to both the accounting firm and the clients who are receiving this audit process from the firms who are moving from the 1990s based technologies to the more digital approach that's now available to these firms?
hmm So, Mark, traditionally we've had a whole lot of friction in the audit process. We alluded to that earlier with, passing data back and forth. Um, Technology can be an enabler here, and we are in a period of fairly wild swings. If we go back to the 15, 20, 25-year-old software as a service technology and push it forward into the newer to most AI technology, but I always remind people AI started in the late 50s, so let's not be too full of ourselves here. But some of the new AI platforms capability as well. Uh, the mundane work that the clients have had to do and that the auditors had to do, much of that mundane work should be automated. So if we take, a few simple processes that most beginning auditors have done through the years, cash reconciliations, AP reconciliations, so forth, the AIs today are getting good enough to do much of that in a fairly automated fashion. All right. So if you're spending less time on manipulating the data, you can spend more time on analyzing the data. And one of my associates many years ago actually said, you know, accountants fall to the 80-20 rule. 80% of the time manipulating the data, 20% thinking about it. And it should be exactly the opposite. 80% of the time analyzing, thinking about the result, and only 20% doing the manipulation. That's where I think technology is going to help us and is helping us. The data that we need can flow through these systems far more readily today than it could before. Each year seems to be improving that. I'm excited about that. But there's still lots of legacy systems out there that have lots of frictions, lots of barriers in the way to our audit teams.
I agree with the thinking there, Randy. It's just friction across the whole process, and we're trying to audit businesses who have been able to more progressively embrace technology. If, as the auditors, we don't remain at least parity in our adoption of technology, I liken it to the police trying to catch the thieves, and the thieves have now got the Lamborghini, and the police are still on horseback. What do we think is going to happen there? So, I think that there's an importance here of trying to maintain the credibility of the profession comes through embracing new technologies, embracing new ways of working, and being comfortable with going through that learning curve. But ultimately, I think that clients are looking for their advisors to have gone through that learning curve and be able to help them. What I'd really fear for the profession is if it were the other way round and the clients are effectively pushing and dragging accounting firms to embrace what are becoming very mainstream technologies at this point in time.
Mhm. Well, perhaps this is a bit of a flop on this one, but the fact of the matter is, most audit teams are not that significantly large where the cost of the technology is a major factor. Whereas a lot of businesses, the number of seats that they have to license and so forth, the expense can be quite large. So, my belief is that wise accounting firms can be far more nimble than their clients. So, what I have encouraged and frankly spent a career doing is, accountants, I want you to use the best technologies available because it saves you time. It allows you to make more money. It allows you to deliver a better quality work product. So tell me why you wouldn't invest in that. And I guess going to your Lamborghini and horse analogy, Mark, uh, I have, with intent, embarrassed a few assurance partners in the past saying, you know, compared to your car out in the parking lot, the investment in the technology here seems pretty minor. How much money do you make with your car and how much money do you make with your technology? You make the decision, but just seems to me that you may want to invest in the tools of the trade.
It's a very pertinent point, which I'm sure lands in different ways with different people, Randy. But I like
Yeah, I've been told to kiss off, but I've also been saying I've been told now it's a good that's a good point, a good idea. Yeah, I guess you're right. We should maybe consider just investing a little bit more in our own business rather than our own persons.
mindset of an entrepreneur rather than a different take on it. You work with a lot of accounting firms, all sizes, all different approaches. Technology and innovation, there's a lot of opportunity when it comes to how accounting firms are typically performing this audit process. So, what do you see as some of the biggest opportunities for firms to modernize their audit process and bring innovation to their audit work?
Mhm. Well, first off, I'm just going to blanket state that generally inside accounting firms, the auditors are more technically proficient than their tax or client accounting services counterparts. Why? Because they've had to learn a whole lot more different platforms, tools, and so forth. That's a pretty normal thing. And the legacy auditing platforms have required lots of additional tools to work. So you had to plug in all sorts of things to feed in data and report out of the data and so forth. Um, if you can follow my favorite rule of the last 5 to 7 years, fewer tools is better, less is more. If you can get to a modern audit platform, you do not need as many different parts to make everything work together. The platforms should provide all of the key functionality that you need, connecting to accounting systems, for example, the feeds we talked about earlier, where perhaps some of the data can go back and forth, the collaboration, the communication that can occur, the automated PBC, if you want to go back that far in our conversation. So, to me, being thoughtful about choosing your audit platform lets you build for the future. And frankly, if you've done it right, should actually reduce the overall um, friction, should reduce the overall costs when you make those type of transitions, and just make it easier for the auditors to do the work from anywhere. The pandemic really kind of forced this remote auditing thing upon us, probably for the good in some cases, probably for the bad in some cases. But the ability to effectively work um, on a client from anywhere at any time and collaboratively with others on your team has been enabled by most of these modern platforms. And there's a lot of tools, and I'll just use Adobe PDF as an example. that you were using to mark work papers and whatnot, that should all be inside the platform as an example. And it's just one less tool, one less expense that I don't see that you actually need in most situations.
That certainly resonates with a lot of the firms that we're working with right now, seeing a trend towards firms trying to pick their suite provider for a particular service that can get them as many different capabilities under one roof as possible, and then being very targeted and specific about niche tools that are going to be added to that. Particularly with what we're seeing is a real proliferation of AI based tools that are doing a very narrow activity within the audit process, the tax process, etc. And so a lot of firms are very mindful that if they go and pick and choose a lot of these different niche tools, very soon they're going to have a very convoluted technology stack with not just the friction and the problems that that causes with user experience, but also their data is all over the place. Their ability to mine and use that data for AI is now very fragmented. So I think what you share there, Randy, around a tech stack consolidation and a real focus on who are the vendors that they're going to really anchor their firm to, that is a very astute observation right now based on what I'm seeing in the broader profession as well.
And Mark, to that point, a year ago at this time, I was recreating new CPE courses. And in the fourth quarter of 24, it had become clear to me that there were 10 plus AI audit tools, 10 plus tax AI tools, and 20 plus client accounting services AI tools. And when I got into the heart of writing the courses, I realized I was wrong. There were 20 plus AI audit tools, 20 plus tax audit tools, actually almost 40, as it turns out, and 70 plus client accounting services tools. So by the time I was looking at all of the tools, I actually wound up with over 100 AI tools for those three primary areas of practice. And I'm thinking, okay, if you're going to try to learn this, now we got a licensing expense, we got an integration expense, it just it, it's like putting band-aids on problems. I think one of my favorite assurance partner comments of the last few years was, "Look, Randy, we called you in because when we get a splinter in our finger, we've been putting a band-aid on it. We get a splinter in another finger, we put a band-aid on it. And right now we've got 8 fingers with band-aids on them. Your job is take off all the band-aids, take out the splinters, and put a pair of gloves on us." And it's like, okay, the right platform is a pair of gloves. A whole bunch of independent tools, those are splinters and band-aids. Now, I'm not trying to belittle the new tools. There's some wonderful ideas, but if you're only solving one vector, one element of a problem, is it a valuable enough problem to justify the licensing, the learning, the integration, all those things that you have to do? And in many cases, I'm saying, hey, I love the technology solution, like what you've done. No, that's not the right way to do it.
And I think that when I speak to firms, too many of them are taking what I describe as a magpie approach to this. And it's the latest, shiniest thing that's knocked on their door and done a demo to them. And they'll be discussing with me, oh, we're thinking about this, we've looked at this, it's good, it solves this particular thing. And often it won't pass the next question I ask, which is that one of the top 5 problems you've got in your business today? And all too often it's like, no, it's probably nowhere near it. It's like, okay, so why are we trying to solve that when we've got at least 5, probably more likely 20 other things that if we solved those would have a more meaningful impact? I've told a number of firms recently, what you should be doing is putting your team into a room and getting them to write on a whiteboard what the biggest problems are that they face. What is wasting their time? What is a friction point? Or what is something that if they could only do it better, it would add more value to the client, produce a better outcome? If they came out of that room with a ranked list of the top 10 things that are annoying them, frustrating them, stopping them, that's your innovation list, not which cute new AI tool has just knocked on your door and done a demo for you. So, how do firms reconcile this magpie approach of there's so many cool things out there and new things? And that's great because this audit area has seen so little investment in innovation if we go back the last 10, 20 years. How do we reconcile that enthusiasm with actually really focusing on what the problems at hand are and the things that we really need to fix as a priority?
Mhm. And I'm fascinated by your magpie, analogy because I use bug to a light. Light enters the room and bug flies to it. Light enters the room, the bug flies to it. And my approach on picking the top problems is similar to yours, but I actually have a couple of things I ask firms to do. List your top 15 problems ranked in order and the top 5 things that you've got today and you don't want to lose. So notice this I'm not trying to keep us in the past, but I don't want to lose beneficial or good things that we've got by making a change because it's easy to forget, uh, you know, things that are working right. But this idea of prioritization is a big deal. And, the pandemic really drove home the talent shortage problem. And as assurance partners in particular, you want to maintain your team's work environment. And I focus far more on the teams now than I do on the clients. If we were having this conversation 10 years ago, it would have been a far more client centric discussion. But today it tends to be what's best for the team where we can deliver the best client service. And it's a little bit of a flip on that. So, as managers, you have to ask that question. Now, as buyers, if you're the client, clearly you want to be talking to firms about who can deliver you the best work product and who has the most expertise and have you been at this a while, those types of discussions. But when it comes to the platform discussion, which is really where we're at on this, you have to be proactive and as a team pick the right tool for your team. And there are some really great sales pitches out there that you should not listen to because you're going to suffer from the bug to the light or the magpie problem, whichever way you want to call it out.
Great way of thinking about it, Randy. As we look to wrap up the conversation, what are the three things that you'd like people to take away from today's discussion?
Well, as accounting firms providing audit services, I'd have one list. As clients, I might have a slightly different. There's going to be overlap. But, I think one of the comments I'll make is you have to figure out how to collaborate effectively. And collaboration to me includes the PBC list, the communication, all that collaboration is one key element, number one. Number two, you've got to be prepared for the future. I called out the model context protocol, the AI use of these platforms, but we've got to begin to assume that the amount of data that we're dealing with is going to get very large and it needs to flow freely and be able to be tracked. So that's true on both sides of the fence on this. And then I think number three is you want to use your people in the most effective way possible. And that does mean proper preparation. So, from an auditor perspective, that's the appropriate planning and communicating that to the client. If you're the client, it's the proper organization. It's a real simple, straightforward trying to eliminate the rework, the redundancy of picking up and putting down things. So maybe my list, Chris, or sorry, Mark, wound up being very much the same for both sides here.
I appreciate the way you've consolidated those into one on the fly there, Randy. Really enjoyed today's conversation. For anyone who wants to hear more or read more of your thoughts, Randy, where's the best place for them to follow up and find you?
Well, probably the best way is the CPA Practice Advisor. That publication has published my columns for a lot of years. And as I've gone back and looked at historical ones written 20 years ago, I realized those actually still apply. So the columns are there. Otherwise, my K2 Enterprises business, K2E.com, or my NMGI business, NMGI.com. I'm there all the time. I do communicate via email, so that's the most clean way to get her done.
Randy, on behalf of all of the people who've listened to this conversation, I'd like to thank you for the insights you've shared and the wisdom you've imparted on us. I've really enjoyed today's conversation.
Thank you, Mark, for the opportunity to work with you and all your listeners. Have a fine day.